Welcome to the debate. Our topic today is a profound clash between strategic necessity and international principle. It all emerges from a very specific and intense sequence of events. The declarations by former U.S. President Donald Trump and his administration calls for the control or even annexation of Greenland.
And that specific context is just so critical, isn't it? These weren't just random comments. These calls for annexation followed immediately after that rapid assertive operation in Caracas, the one that led to the capture of Nicolás Maduro. It really signaled an alarming shift toward unilateral action.
Absolutely. The tension we're grappling with here is just immense. I mean, it's pitting the U.S. assertion of vital security interests in the Arctic against the deeply held principle of sovereignty of a NATO ally, Denmark. This is realpolitik meeting the foundational architecture of the post-war world head-on.
It's an incredibly high-stakes confrontation, so we have to ask, is the foundation of global cooperation itself strong enough to withstand what the U.S., views as this overriding strategic imperative?
So the central question before us is this: does the imperative of U.S. security, driven by this volatile Arctic strategic theater, justify actions that directly threaten the foundational principles and, frankly, the continued existence of the NATO alliance? I'm going to argue that the U.S. actions, even the aggressive ones, reflect a necessary strategic calculation, one that's driven by a rising geopolitical reality and a perceived operational weakness in Danish control.
And I'm going to argue that any attempt at forced annexation would trigger the total implosion of the post-1945 security system. And that alternative, non-destructive paths exist, and they absolutely must be pursued to secure those very same U.S. interests.
My core thesis is that the U.S. interest in Greenland is an urgent, what the source material calls a summation of security plus minerals plus routes plus competition with Russia and China. It just makes the issue too critical to leave to the status quo. I mean, look at the strategic imperative here. Greenland is in a geometrically valuable position. It sits right on the hinge between the Arctic and the North Atlantic. This placement is absolutely crucial for modern defense.
Crucial, perhaps, but that's not a justification for violating the territorial integrity of an ally.
But this isn't just about general defense. We're talking about critical capabilities, from missile early warning, a function served since the Cold War by the Patufic base, formerly Thule, to air and space situational awareness across the entire Arctic corridor. And what's more, securing this territory is vital for protecting North Atlantic submarine warfare routes and supply lines into Europe. This strategic imperative it's just undeniable.
I agree. The real estate is valuable, but the imperative goes deeper than just defense architecture, right? Let's talk about the economic drivers you mentioned.
We have to. There are, and I quote, trillions and trillions of reasons for this interest that go beyond military strategy. I'm talking about critical minerals, specifically the vast untapped reserves of rare earths. These elements, neodymium, dysprosium, they aren't optional components. They are essential for everything from sophisticated military sensors to the magnets required in every wind turbine and electric vehicle. If the U.S. and NATO allies don't secure a reliable non-Chinese supply chain, their entire energy transition and military-industrial base are immediately compromised.
Okay, that's a compelling argument for resource access, but it's still an argument for cooperation, not conquest.
And my final point addresses the operational reality that drove the push in the first place. The implicit message that Danish control is weak, well, it holds a certain operational truth. The Danish government itself has recognized its historically limited capacity for surveillance in that massive, difficult, and expensive Arctic theater. Their efforts to correct this are very recent. So, given the rapid expansion of Russian military infrastructure and significant Chinese activity in the region, relying on a partner struggling to police its own domain is a huge strategic liability for NATO. The U.S. requires secure, reliable, permanent control.
I acknowledge the strategic value you're outlining and the urgency of the mineral supply chain. I really do. But my core thesis is that attempting a forced annexation of a NATO member's territory, even if you dress it up as geopolitical necessity, would detonate the basic principle of trust that sustains the alliance. It would lead directly to its collapse.
How so? I mean, if the security threat is that imminent, doesn't the alliance need to prioritize operational control?
No, because you can't prioritize security by destroying the very source of that security, the collective architecture itself. Let's start with the legal basis. Danish sovereignty is internationally recognized, and it's institutionally solid. It's rooted in history going back to 1721. More importantly, it was reaffirmed through constitutional integration in 1953, and then, critically, solidified in 2009 with the self-governance law. This law specifically grants the Greenlandic people the legal right to self-determination through plebiscites. This is an entrenched, modern, democratic claim.
But that claim relies on the Danish capacity to defend it, which is exactly the point of contention.
Sovereignty is a legal and political fact. It's not a function of military budget alone. A forced takeover would be a crisis without precedent in the post-war era. When the Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, spoke about this, she warned that if the U.S. were to militarily attack another NATO country, the entire post-war security system would implode totally. We're talking about the complete abandonment of core principles. The risk versus the reward here is entirely asymmetric. The U.S. would gain Greenland, yes, but it would lose all of Europe and the trust of all of its historical allies. That is an act of geopolitical self-destruction.
Okay, let's turn to the heart of the disagreement then, which is the nature of sovereignty itself. I think we have to distinguish between juridical and operational control. While juridical sovereignty is recognized, they hold the legal deed, so to speak. Operational capability is the real issue demanding immediate attention.
I see why you think that, and I agree capacity is relevant, but let me frame it differently. Trump and his advisors, they aren't just complaining about Copenhagen's defense budget. They are explicitly questioning the basis of the Danish territorial claim itself. That is politically destabilizing, and it's legally unsound. Sovereignty, in our international system, isn't determined by who has the largest navy. If the issue is genuinely operational capacity, why is the U.S. prioritizing breaching the alliance over, say, offering a massive joint investment package to solidify NATO's northern flank through Copenhagen?
Because the stakes are too finite to rely on voluntary investment packages. The U.S. needs secure, reliable control to counter the threats Trump cited, Russian nuclear submarines and Chinese research vessels that are, quote, all over the region. We know Danish efforts to correct their spending are recent and follow historic gaps. So if the Arctic is truly the new military frontier, and the U.S. is the only NATO power truly positioned to secure it, how can we be tethered to a system where the legal owner is struggling with the operational reality? That deficiency is a security threat to all of NATO.
But the solution to that deficiency is a massive, coordinated Article 3 investment among allies, a commitment to develop capacity, not annexation. Annexation, even framed as a security imperative, is fundamentally a breach of international law. More importantly, it destroys the underlying assumption of mutual respect that NATO is built on. If the U.S. can just take Greenland, what stops them from taking Iceland next? You undermine the entire framework.
You're assuming the strategic security threat isn't already destabilizing the alliance? If Russia achieves strategic dominance in the Arctic because we deferred to juridical sovereignty, the entire alliance fails anyway. That brings us directly to the implications of ally-on-ally aggression and the limits of Article 5.
Indeed, and the treaty was explicitly written for an external enemy. While Article 5 lacks a mechanism for an ally attacking an ally, the spirit of mutual trust is non-negotiable. That trust is the firewall. If the U.S. attacks Denmark, the political reaction, which we saw from leaders like the UK's Keir Starmer, would be unanimous. They would view the U.S. as the aggressor, not the savior.
I'm not totally convinced by that line of reasoning. That's an interesting point rooted in diplomatic sentiment, but I would frame it differently. The U.S. might argue that its action isn't an attack as defined in the treaty, but a necessary internal security realignment. The U.S. provides the overwhelming majority of NATO's military capability. In this context, the action is done for the protection of NATO itself, to prevent the alliance's catastrophic strategic failure in the polar corridor.
But securing a location by destroying the political cohesion of the pact is a completely paradoxical strategy. It's sacrificing the means to achieve the end.
Look, the threat of Russian and Chinese influence expanding in the Arctic, is a profound threat to NATO unity, perhaps greater than the political fallout from a forced takeover. We have to weigh two disastrous outcomes. Which risk is genuinely greater? A catastrophic strategic failure in the Arctic, or a political implosion of an alliance whose viability is already being questioned? Sometimes, geopolitical survival dictates harsh choices that prioritize territory over abstract principles of alliance etiquette.
It is not etiquette, it's the rule of law. And if the U.S. can unilaterally redefine what an internal security realignment is to seize allied territory, then NATO ceases to be an alliance. It becomes a hierarchy, where the main power dictates the terms to everyone else. That is why the Danish Prime Minister's warning that the entire system would collapse remains so undeniable.
That brings us to the practicality of alternative paths. I am just deeply skeptical that voluntary partnership agreements can provide the permanence this situation demands. I'm not convinced by the logic that partnership is sufficient, because partnership agreements are inherently voluntary. They're subject to political fluctuations, both in Denmark and in Greenland.
Right, but the political reality of internal Danish and Greenlandic politics, that's part of the sovereignty you're trying to ignore.
Precisely. U.S. interests, which include guaranteed access to critical minerals and reliable defense lines, demand permanence that supersedes those political shifts. Annexation, while politically painful, achieves permanent strategic security. Partnership agreements just can't guarantee that, especially considering the 2009 self-governance law that explicitly allows Greenland the right to full independence. If Greenland becomes fully independent, the U.S. could lose the security assurance provided by Denmark's NATO membership. Independence could create even greater uncertainty.
That's a compelling point against partnership instability, but I think we're ignoring a middle ground that provides permanence without destruction. Have you considered the path of facilitated independence followed by a special association pact?
Explain how that resolves the U.S. demand for guaranteed, permanent access.
Well, analysts suggest that if Greenland eventually chooses independence, it could form a subsequent association pact with the U.S. for both economic development and defense. And crucially, this pact could be ratified by Congress and the new Greenland Act Parliament. This would grant the agreements on mineral access and military base usage like Ipitufik the durability of a long-term treaty, functionally equivalent to permanence. This path secures American access without making Greenland a U.S. territory or destroying NATO.
It sounds elegant, I'll give you that, but it relies on a future political choice by a sovereign population. That introduces risk. It introduces timeline uncertainty, and even a ratified treaty can be subject to renegotiation or withdrawal, unlike U.S. territorial control. The former administration's explicit push for annexation signals a desire to remove all political risk entirely. They're operating on a crisis clock.
And that desire for zero risk is precisely what threatens to eliminate the entire collective security system. We have to remember the cost here. The loss of trust means the U.S. would have to bear the entire security burden globally without the political legitimacy or support of its allies. Is guaranteed access to a rare earth mine worth the unilateral breakdown of the world order? I submit that it is not. The path of facilitated independence respects both self-determination and U.S. security needs through principled engagement.
So this debate really highlights the profound geopolitical pressure the U.S. is feeling over the Arctic. Greenland's location, combined with the trillions in mineral wealth and the clear expansion of Russia and China into that polar corridor, it just makes the current status quo untenable from Washington's perspective. My argument is that the strategic clock is ticking, and the current legalistic framework can't entirely supersede what is perceived as an overriding national security necessity.
And I come at it from a fundamentally different way. The material makes it clear that the core disagreement is not about if Greenland is vital, but how the U.S. seeks to secure that vitality. The strategic necessity is real, but the attempt to achieve it through aggression against an ally, which the Danish Prime Minister warned would cause the total implosion of the security architecture, is simply too high a price. The path of association, or partnership, while complex, remains the only viable route that avoids geopolitical catastrophe.
We both agree the stakes are existential. The question is whose existence we prioritize, the alliance's existing political structure or U.S. strategic security in a rapidly changing Arctic.
And whether those two existences can, or even should, be seen as mutually exclusive.
The materials suggest there is no simple resolution when strategic necessity clashes so directly with bedrock principles of cooperation and sovereignty. The listener is left to weigh the value of permanent Arctic security against the profound and potentially irreversible cost of alliance stability.